Hello, everyone. Welcome to Management 5804, Leadership and Technology-Based Organizations. I'm Dr. David Townsend, and this will be Lecture 1.1, our first lecture of the semester. And so here we're going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the broad challenges that leaders face when trying to manage technology strategy in complex environments. And so this will help us kind of set an agenda for the semester, identifying some key challenges and some key ideas that we'll cover in quite a bit more detail as we move through the material. So let's dive in. So to the surprise of no one, Apple recently was the first company to hit $1 trillion in market capitalization. And so again, sort of the first company in history to achieve this pretty impressive milestone. What's fascinating about it as you think through the specifics is it was just a couple of decades ago that Apple was about to go bankrupt. And when I went through business school for the very first time when I was a pretty young kid, all of our cases in the mid to late 90s centered on why Apple was about to go out of business and all the strategic choices the companies needed to make in order to revitalize themselves. And, it's a good thing they didn't listen to us at that point because Apple probably never would have climbed out of the hole that they were in and achieved this incredible milestone. But as we see here in this picture, right, and this is even a couple years old now, Apple is still the #1 mobile brand in the world. In this case, I think they don't have the dominant number of handsets that have been sold, but they do have the most in terms of sales. And so there's even some speculation that Apple commands over 100%, if you will. I'm not quite sure the mathematics of this, but over 100% of the total profits generated by the industry. And again, I think it's reasonable to say that whether it's 100% or less, they do control the vast majority of how this industry evolves and changes. And here we can kind of see a distribution of different returns. And so we're going to talk about actually a couple of these other companies that are represented in this top 10 graph here. But even that, it's changed somewhat over the last few years as these different companies have jockeyed for position. But Apple still maintains the lead in terms of all profitability. But if we look at the overall distribution, we can notice something specific in terms of comparing the overall market share. And so you see Apple overall at this point with the highest amount of market share, and then followed by Samsung. Clearly Samsung's had some issues and dipped. And then some of the Chinese manufacturers have actually climbed up and closer to the lead in terms of number of handsets, but are not as profitable overall. But as we look across this distribution, we see a couple firms with the vast majority of the market share, and then we see kind of this long tail of other firms with much lower amounts of market share in this space. And this is what we call a power law distribution. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, this is a representation of a broader distributional pattern that seems to show up in many technology arenas. We're also going to talk about this as the long tail. There's been some really interesting work by folks like Chris Anderson, the founder of Wired Magazine, and others that look at strategy or technology strategy when the overall outcomes really sort into this power law distribution. And so this is characterized by a few or a small number of hyper performers that capture almost all of the gains or all of the performance advantages in a particular market, and then followed by this long tail as we kind of go to the right here of a whole bunch of average to kind of below average performers. And so the question really is, do these markets tend to the distribution tends to shape out like this? And so if we sort of think through this in a variety of other settings, you can see video game consoles. Again, kind of a different format here because you are comparing these product platforms across the same manufacturers, but you see distributions oftentimes in technology arenas that really look like this power law distribution. And so one of the crucial questions we'll tackle is why are these seemingly ubiquitous power law distributions somewhat inevitable in these spaces? And the real challenge has to do with the nature of complexity. And so in the IT world, as many of you know that work in it, or those of you who compete in a variety of environments where it's driven by a lot of IT investment, there's been a massive increase in complexity, right? So what do we mean by complexity? Well, complexity involves many different factors that interact in unpredictable ways, right? So there's a variety of factors with the firm's business model or its strategic execution, its products, the way it interacts with customers, a variety of things that create these feedback loops that generate those power law distributions. And so this is kind of the what some people will call the Matthew effect, or the rich get richer. And this seems to be something that's fundamental in the sort of arena of technology strategy. And so power law distributions are almost always the outcome, and the nature of complexity with all these different factors that are there that are interacting in non-predictable ways, or a system that feeds back on itself, tends to drive the emergence of that. And so that's going to create some real challenges for us if we start to try to develop strategy, right? So it's important for us to kind of understand these key dimensions of complexity. And we'll talk about this in more detail here, but in general, multiplicity, right? Having lots of different factors are very complicated markets, and those multitude of factors are interdependent. They influence each other, they shape, and then they're also very different, right? So there's a sheer diversity of things that can arise and influence how that environment itself is going to evolve and unfold. And the interaction of these things is what creates such a core strategic problem for firms. And so for managers, right, there's going to be two major problems that we're going to talk about and contend with. One of them is unintended consequences. And so you can think about this in another arena. With in the agricultural arena, we spent a fair amount of time over the past few decades trying to inoculate, especially on factory farms, trying to inoculate animals from bacterial infections. So we might use antibiotics, widespread use of antibiotics in ag, but that's created this kind of second order unintended consequence where now you have problems of antibiotic resistance as these bacterium have continued to evolve to try to contend with the increasing use of antibiotics. And so in the agricultural industry, those are huge challenges they face, continuing to try to stay ahead of these trends. And so in addition to unintended consequences, the second problem is the outcomes, right? These power law distribution outcomes are aggregations of a whole bunch of different choices that strategic choices that the firms are going to make. And they happen to evolve in very complex ways as well, right? So it's going to create a wide variety of problems with complexity. Right? And so one of the particular ones is going to be this vantage point problem. And we'll talk about this in the next lecture because this is going to create a problem of framing. And so in that, we'll actually discuss some of the reasons why some of the incumbent firms struggled to recognize the threat that Apple was posing to them, mostly because they were looking from a particular vantage point, right? And they were framing the threat of Apple in incorrect ways by using old models or old reasoning patterns to try to make sense of what Apple was going to do. This is also just driven by the cognitive limits of managers, right? I mean, we're clearly not omniscient. We don't know everything we need to know to be successful. And because we look at these challenges from a particular vantage point and we're boundedly rational, right? We only have a bit of information that we can use to make decisions. This can create tunnel vision where we only focus on a couple of key things and try to use that to drive the company forward, which leaves us sometimes susceptible to miss out or ignore seemingly rare events. And so, again, we'll give you kind of a tangible example in Lecture 1.2 when we think about the challenges that companies face when trying to interpret what Apple is going to do. And so applying the old PC versus Mac competitive dynamics model to understanding the threat of the iPhone proved to be an ill-fated challenge. In the case this week, we'll actually talk about Google Glass and how Google even misapplied kind of a framing strategy to try to position Google Glass relative to the smartphone, particularly the iPhone. And so how that kind of limited the effectiveness of their innovation strategy. So in that, we're going to talk a fair amount this semester about this Dine model of complexity. And again, as I mentioned in the syllabus and in the notes for this week, I'm not a big fan of acronyms. Most of the time they proliferate in universities. But the Dine model maybe will help you kind of link these factors together because this will really form a lot of the specific ways that we discuss the challenges companies face throughout the semester. But the first one is diagnostic complexity. And as we talked about just a couple minutes ago, this really reflects the challenge of identifying the main or key elements of a system. And so tunnel vision here will prevent us, or confirmation bias even, can prevent us from identifying critical factors that are going to potentially challenge or undermine our strategy. And the second problem of complexity, as we talked about, is the interactive complexity. So not only is it difficult to identify what the relevant factors might be, but it's also difficult for us to figure out how those factors are going to interact with each other and what kind of feedback loops are going to form. And this really stretches these cognitive limits that we face, this bounded rationality that we face as managers, because feedback loops can take small advantages and really you amp those up to a point that we're unable to keep up. So even small little differences between us and our competitors can prove to be a wide strategic gulf, so to speak, down the road as those small advantages turn into significant differences in performance outcomes. And the third one has to do with non-predictability. So because it's difficult for us to figure out what's going on and then to comprehend or understand how those factors are interacting together, that makes complex environments inherently non-predictable. We can't always determine what's going to happen next. And so we apply framing strategies as a predictive tool to try to figure out what's next in an environment when the sheer nature of complexity means that we can't really see what's going to happen after these factors, so past this point of interaction to predict these long-term outcomes. And sort of the last challenge there is because of these feedback loops, that process of exponential change or really rapid changes in an environment can produce massive changes, massive growth, or massive decline in profitability for organizations. And so seemingly rare events or marginal competitors. We'll talk about this notion of disruptive innovation and how disruptive innovations can merge from the fringes of our industry to rapidly supplant us. Again, creating enormous challenges for managers to contend with these issues. And so as a result, technology strategy is a different set of problems for CEOs and top leaders of organizations, right? It requires kind of looking at a couple of different critical elements that oftentimes aren't brought front and center in many strategy discussions. And so this comes from the technology strategy reading. But again, because technology itself is a fundamental driver in this space, we've got to be able to understand the commercialization potential. And specific here, when is a technology or a new innovation going to be disruptive? When is something going to emerge from the fringes or the outside or the outskirts of our market that's going to undermine or change the specific way that our industry itself operates or is configured? And some of the issues there are disruptive innovations are aided by complementary assets, right? So other tools and skills and capabilities that firms bring to bear to enhance the effectiveness of the disruptive innovations that they're trying to commercialize. And all of that is also enhanced by the role of the ecosystems or platforms, right, as new different types of organizational structures. You might call them business models now, but it's simply just the recipe of how that organization is built. And these ecosystems or platforms not only enhance or allow us to commercialize or drive a technology forward, but they can also be sources of innovation in their own right. And so again, a business model is not just a place that allows us to execute on a strategy, but it becomes a crucial part of our strategizing process for the firm. And then complementers, right? How that ecosystem broadly is developed. And so these companies, suppliers, or demand side reps working together, so their efforts mutually benefit each other as part of this complexity process that can really drive the success of technology strategy forward. So all these things together increase the importance of timing. And this is, again, difficult because there are advantages for us for getting it right and being early, but then we don't necessarily understand what's happening in our market and we can't completely predict how this is going to unfold. Then we're put in a difficult spot of actually being able to deconstruct or to understand what steps we should take next. And so the timing, again, as we talked about these exponential returns, produces this increasing returns to scale. Again, this is this Matthew effect. The rich get richer. And so if you're early and you're getting it right and these advantages are kicking in, you can grow much faster at a much more rapid pace than many other organizations. And some of that's facilitated by what we'll talk about as network effects, where if you've built into a network or you've got a business model that leverages a tight web of relationships across customers and different suppliers, right, those feedback loops kick in there and again can drive your success forward, which leads many people to try to be first mover, to move into new market spaces early, which certainly has its own challenges. And as the reading highlights, switching costs can be very difficult. And so we'll talk about kind of the opposite side challenges when you're trying to build a new innovation and get customers to switch over. So these four factors really affect and influence the timing of our strategic actions, which again is at the heart of the difficulties of building and managing technology strategy within these complex environments. And so in that, we're going to look at a couple different structural patterns that underlie or undergird some of these issues. And so we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about the S-curve as a diffusion pattern, but you can see here this sort of this nonlinearity, almost this S-looking distribution here. And these, the y-axis here is performance, or you can even look at rate of growth or rate of change. And you see that the rate of growth or rate of change or performance gains changes as you move through this process. And this is a great example here of a disruptive innovation where, early on, the established technology is doing very well, growing, it's becoming effective, and then at this T1, this time one, a new disruptive innovation is emerging kind of at the fringes or the bottom of a market. But then as you get to time two, it supplants or overtakes the established technology and and through really rapid growth. So it seemingly comes out of nowhere from the flank, so to speak, of the organization or at the fringes of the market. And so this is a classic picture of a disruptive innovation and why technology strategy is so difficult, because competitors can seemingly come out of nowhere with something brand new that often supplants or disrupts or changes the way that our market or industry is structured. So this creates a whole host of other challenges to understand emerging markets and disruptive innovation, to look at supply side constraints. So again, the nature of the resources and capabilities we have shape the effectiveness of different disruption strategies. And so as we'll talk about, this really amplifies the need for more agile approaches to not only identify customers, but to think about the ways that the firm itself can be organized. And so, innovators in technology arenas face enormous sets of challenges, and incumbents face an enormous set of challenges of defending against that. And so this complex set of issues really is at the heart of what we'll tackle this semester. And through that, right, try to gain insights into our second pattern here, which is this technology adoption life cycle, right? So this S-curve filters in to a distribution of different customer segments. And as we sort of move from early adopters, right, the early people that are giving us all that growth, into the mainstream, one of the things we'll talk a lot about is the specific strategies we use to go mainstream with our new innovations are the very things that undermine us and leave us susceptible to new disruptive innovations emerging at the fringes of our market. So what we'll see is kind of this almost this dialectical give and take between incumbents and new entrants, and we continually move through this cycle of creative destruction. So if you're really successful going mainstream, you're going to be that much more susceptible to new disruptive innovations emerging at your flank. If you're a disruptive innovation, it's very difficult to go mainstream, and you have to compromise oftentimes on the very things that made you successful with your early customers in order to reach those pragmatic mainstream customers. And so this ongoing cyclical process is really at the heart of these challenges. And so within that, right, we'll talk about the role of business models and talk about other factors. So our three structural patterns, again, we'll cover in more detail later, will be disruptive innovation, crossing the chasm, and then business model design. And so as kind of a final slide here to look at this, right, here is Nokia and BlackBerry market cap. Really in 2007, you see right at the height of, or right when the first iPhone was released, and both these companies were doing extremely well. And even the investor community didn't necessarily get it right, because you see both firms' market caps kind of peak in 2008, somewhere around in 2008, and then go through this pretty significant decline to the point at now where both of them have pivoted almost completely away from the smartphone or mobility industry onto entirely new market verticals. As we'll see in the next lecture, a lot of it's because they misinterpreted the challenge that Apple was posing to them. And Apple brought some very successful strategies, not only to disrupt this market, but also to go mainstream very rapidly and very effectively. Some of it was a set of design choices, some of it was a set of strategic choices that the firm made, and then also coupled with a very effective business model that built out a product ecosystem that utilized a significant number of overall advantages, with complementary assets or supplier relationships to essentially drive the two leading players out of the market almost entirely within about 7 years. And so it's a pretty remarkable story. And certainly now that Apple's over $1 trillion in market cap, you can see that that explosive growth really came at the expense of other companies. And so this will really be at the heart. These tensions and challenges of building and managing technology and strategy in complex environments is at the heart of what we'll discuss this semester. And we'll kind of break down the problems into much more granular detail and then come up with a set of strategies, ways that both incumbents, if they're the ones defending, or new entrants, if they're the ones attacking, can leverage these tools in order to enhance organizational success.